Welcome back to our ongoing series of Shiurim in Hilchos Shabbos. Today we begin a new series in the halachas of Muktzah. This will be a longish series. It will probably take at least 5 shiurim, and today's shiur will be more in the nature of an introduction without going into many of the halachas. First of all, concerning the study of Hilchos Muktzah, the Alter Rebbe writes in Igeres HaKodesh in Tanya, Simin Chov Gimel, the Alter Rebbe encourages his Chassidim that on Shabbos afternoon, the Shabbos Kodesh Ba'alois Tamincho, in Mincha time, Yasku B'Hilchos Shabbos. People should engage in the study of the halachas of Shabbos. And the Alter Rebbe explains that there are many halachas of Shabbos, and one could very easily, inadvertently, chas v'sholem, stumble in those laws of Shabbos, even so far as to transgress laws of Shabbos which involve chorus or skila, because of his lack of knowledge. And lack of knowledge is not really an excuse if one is able to learn. Said the Alter Rebbe, that's concerning Meloches Mamish. When it comes to Isurei Divres Toifrim, Drabonon prohibitions, Sherobu Kemoi Robu Lamailo, which are so numerous, Ubefrat B'isurei Muktzeh, particularly in the laws of Muktzeh, the Shchichi Tuvo, which are very common. And although they are Drabonon, V'chamurim Divrei Toifrim Yoisem Divrei Torah, and the words of these Toifrim of the Chakomim are in a way more grave than the words of Torah. And he brings an example. And therefore the Alter Rebbe exhorts us to learn the laws of Shabbos generally, and more particularly the laws of Muktzah, because they're so frequent and so common, and one can easily infringe on them because of ignorance. So, as we learned several months back, this year is the 200th years since the Alter Rebbe's passing in Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel in 1812 on Chov Dalet Tevis. So we're dedicating ourselves particularly to the halachas as they are in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. So it's particularly apt within this year to cover the laws of Muktzah as the Alter Rebbe encourages us to do. The halachas of Muktzah, as we have seen, the Alter Rebbe says, are Drabonon. There's some discussion about that between Achroinim. The Alter Rebbe clearly adopts the position that the laws of Muktzah are Drabonon. But when we say Drabonon, we may have an erroneous picture of some Rov in a shtetl proclaiming a ban on something. Or even if we picture Tanoim and Ameroim at the time of the Bayis Sheni declaring a ban on something or other, it's a false picture. The Rabbanons can go back to Moshe Rabbeinu. But in the case of Muktzah, there's a long history. And the history, just to give an example, so we'll see how far back it stretches, the Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos, Daf Lamed Aleph, that David HaMelech passed away on Shabbos. David HaMelech, the Gemara relates, asked of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when will be my end? Hoidieni Hashem Kitzi in Tehillim. Hashem, inform me of my end. When am I going to die? And Hashem said, no, I don't divulge the time of people's end. So David HaMelech to ask Ribono Shel Olam, okay, at least on what day will it be? What day of the week? And Hashem said, on Shabbos. So the Gemara relates that David HaMelech every single Shabbos engaged in the study of Torah incessantly. So much so that when the Malach HaMoves came to take his life, couldn't, because David was so wrapped up in Torah. Torah is Torah Chaim, the Torah of life, that there was no room for death. Therefore, the Malach HaMoves resorted to a ruse. He created a commotion outside. David HaMelech went to see what's going on, and as he was going down the step collapsed under him, he fell, and there he died. So, true enough, he was nostalgic on Shabbos. Now you all recall that David HaMelech was nostalgic on Shavuos. So it's a hot summer day in Eretz Yisrael, and the sun is blazing down on David's body. So Shlomo HaMelech is left dealing with things, and Shlomo HaMelech sent a shaila, what do I do with the body of my late father, David HaMelech? He's lying in the sun. He'll decompose. It's a bizoyin, it's a disgrace. And the members of the Sanhedrin responded with a halacha that's special to the case of a person who has died and his body has to be taken care of. What exactly the recommendation is, we're not going to go into yet. But suffice it to say that Shlomo HaMelech is already aware of a halacha of muktzah. Why is he asking? Why not just move the body out of the sun? Bring him to a cool place. Because Shlomo HaMelech knows that a human body is muktzah. He can't move him. That's why he's asking, so what must I do? Must I just leave him? So it's already such a well-established halacha in the time of David and Shlomo. This is what we mean, the beginning of the laws of muktzah, of the Rabbanon. Moving further along historically, when Yidden came from Golus Bovel, let's get our dates right, Yidden come into Eretz Yisrael under Yehoshua. They live in Eretz Yisrael for a total of 890 years, 480 before they build the first Beis Hamikdash, and 410 with the first Beis Hamikdash. So the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed 890 years after Yidden come into Eretz Yisrael in the year Gimel Alofim Sholach, 3,338. From Eretz Yisrael, Yidden go into exile in Bavel for 70 years, which were foretold by the Novi Yirmiyah. At the end of 70 years, Yidden begin to return to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the country and the Beis Hamikdash. There weren't that many Yidden who came back. The initial number was a mere 40,000, even though the government gave them permission to return, but not everybody seized on the opportunity. Many people remained behind. 40,000 people came back to Eretz Yisrael. They were coming from Golus. The land was devastated. It had been settled by people who were enemies of the Jewish people. And they gave the Yidden a very hard time. So even while they are trying to build, they have to, with one hand, as it says in Sefer Ezra, with one hand we're holding the building trowel to plaster walls, and with the other hand we're holding a spear to fend off attacks from enemies who wanted to stop them from building. And the people who came back were poor not only financially, but they were poor in terms of knowledge. That was the period when the Anshe Knesset Hagdoila instituted the Nusach HaTfilah, because people didn't know how to daven. They couldn't daven in their own language as they used to. They couldn't speak Lashon Kodesh even. So they were poor in knowledge, and when they came back, they found Goyim living in Eretz Yisrael, the Kusim, all sorts of unfriendly elements, and those people were trading on Shabbos, and they had an unfair trading advantage. And because of that, some of the Yidden at the time wanted to even out the advantage, and so they started bringing loads of merchandise from near the fields to the town of Yerushalayim on Shabbos. So Nehemiah screams at them, "What are you doing? You just came out of exile, and Hashem sent you into Golus because of your wayward ways of serving Hashem. You dropped the Shabbos and you dropped the mitzvahs, and that's why you were sent into Golus, and now you're being brought back. So what are you doing? You're going right back to it." So Nehemiah had to take many steps in order to get Yidden to live a Torah true life. So the Gemara tells us in Mr. Shabbos that among the measures which Nehemiah enacted was a stringent, extremely severe form of muktzah. So stringent that, just to give us an example, a spoon, the serving spoon, was muktzah, unless you actually had to use it this moment. It's muktzah. Never mind other kelim with which work is done, but even something which is like a serving spoon would also have been muktzah in Nehemiah's days. So pretty much everybody is sitting tight. They're not busy with anything. They were busy with Torah, Tefillah on Shabbos. That's what Nehemiah wanted, that the people should get an education on Shabbos. They should come listen to the Rav and to the Drosha, which the Drosha then consisted of simply of teaching the people the ways of Torah and the halachas, and that way they wouldn't continue to be amaratzim. They would shed their ignorance. But they weren't busy with anything, because whatever they would get busy with, they couldn't touch it. Muktzah. As Shabbos began to regain its rightful place in Jewish life because of the measures that Nehemiah and Ezra and others had taken in order to restore Jewish life to its proper stature, as those measures took effect and Yidden began living according to Torah more and more, so Chachamim began to roll back some of the more stringent forms of muktzah. So anything like cutlery and crockery definitely is not muktzah anymore. Even things which are possibly used for melacha, hammers, screwdrivers, also are not muktzah if they're going to be used for a permissible purpose. We'll learn about that, but not in the shir. And so they progressively rolled back the dinim, the stringencies of the dinim of muktzah, until we have muktzah as we have it today. Even today, The basic premise of Muktzah into Shabbos, he has an imaginary inventory of items which he's going to use on Shabbos. So for instance, a Kiddush cup. Before Shabbos starts, is the Kiddush cup one of the things that are part of your Shabbos world? Yes. We're going to make Kiddush on Shabbos, so the Kiddush Becher will be used. Food, drinks, definitely. The mitzvah of Oinik Shabbos. We're going to eat and drink on Shabbos. Food and drinks are definitely part of the inventory. Clothing, for sure. We're going to get dressed for Shabbos. Clothing is part of my inventory. Hammers. Why would a hammer come into my life on Shabbos? Hammers are used for driving nails. Driving nails is forbidden on Shabbos. It's a malacha, usually it's boine or make bepatish in some cases, but at any rate, driving nails is not a Shabbos-dik activity. So because it's not a Shabbos-dik activity, then the tool for driving nails doesn't come into my life on Shabbos. That's where Muktzah comes in. Those things which are not part of your inventory because they're not part of the Shabbos activities, the tools with which you do those activities should not be moved. So remember that no activity is ever forbidden on Shabbos because the item is muktzah. You sometimes hear people saying things like, you mustn't write on Shabbos, the pen is muktzah. That back to front. If it would be permissible to write on Shabbos, a pen would not be muktzah. You'd be using the pen on Shabbos. The reason the pen becomes muktzah is because writing is forbidden on Shabbos. It's one of the 39 melachos. What purpose does a pen serve? To write, which it cannot serve on Shabbos, and then therefore the pen is out of the inventory of Shabbos items. Once it's out of the inventory, it may not be moved on Shabbos. So the din of muktzah always follows the activity. It never is the reason why an activity is forbidden. No activity ever becomes forbidden because the item with which you do the activity is muktzah. So a lawnmower, what is it used for? To cut grass. Cutting grass is osir on Shabbos, tamalocha, koitzer. Lawnmowers become osir, mukta on Shabbos to be moved. So that's always the premise. First look at the activity and then look at the item. The Rambam explains, and the Alter Rebbe quotes it, as does the Shulchan Aruch, at the beginning of Shin Ches. Shin Ches is the first of a series of 6 simonim which deal with the individual laws of muktzah, and it itself is a long siman in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. It's 89 paragraphs, and that's just one of the 6. So at the beginning of this first siman dealing with muktzah, the Alter Rebbe brings the Rambam, who said, why is it that Chachomim instituted muktzah altogether? And he explains that since we find that a person is not meant to walk on Shabbos the way he walked during the week, or talk on Shabbos the way he talks during the week, ordinary conversations and business conversations, and I'm going to do this or that, they're all not meant to be spoken on Shabbos, as we find in the words of the Novi Yeshaya, which we say Shabbos morning before Kiddush, Im toshuv mishabos raglecho, al tzoyz chafotecha b'yoyim kodshi, You shall honor the Shabbos. Keep your feet away from walking the way you normally do. Keep your words different from the way you normally talk. Don't look to attend to your affairs on Shabbos the way you would do during the week. So if all that is meant to be different from the way it's done during the week, how much more so should a person not move items the way he does during the week, so that it will not be like an ordinary weekday, and a person will end up moving things around and fixing things and transporting them from one corner of the house to another, because after all he's bored. Shabbos he can't do his regular uvda, his regular business, so he's looking for something to do, so he'll find ways of puttering around. So surely one should not carry things around on Shabbos the way he does during the week, because that would destroy the whole character of Shabbos. It would feel like a weekday. Furthermore, there are people who are not craftsmen and laborers. So Shabbos will be for them, if Shabbos merely consists of refraining from labor, for them Shabbos will be like any other day. And there's nothing noticeable about the Shabbos. So those are reasons in order to make Shabbos, to give Shabbos a Shabbosdic character. In the middle, the Alter Rebbe brings the reasoning of the Ravid, who the arch arguer, opponent of the Rambam in Halacha, and his words are printed in the margin of the Rambam on this very Halacha. The Ravid said, why is the Rambam coming up with these reasons when the Gemara gives a reason, and the Rambam makes up reasons and ignores the Gemara's reason? And what is the reason? It's because of the malacha of carrying. If you are free to move things around at will, you will end up carrying them outside. In fact, based on this reasoning, it should be forbidden to move around clothing and spoons and forks, etc., etc. But it would be too much of a harsh imposition on people to say, don't move around all these items which we're constantly needing on Shabbos. So they left that. They didn't decree muktzah on those kind of items, like clothing and like spoons and forks, but things which serve forbidden purposes, that is in fact muktzah, may not be moved. Why? Because we don't want people moving things around, because the next thing you know, they'll be moving them outside. They'll be carrying them from place to place. So according to this is an extension, muktzah is an extension of the laws of carrying. It's a gzeira, so that people will not come to transgress the laws of carrying on Shabbos. We'll now begin with some rules of muktzah. And first of all, we'll discuss what is considered moving muktzah, which is prohibited on Shabbos. First of all of muktzah deals with tiltul. Tiltul means moving from place to place, and not touching something which won't move when you touch it. Even if it's muktzah, may be touched, and something which will not move if it's sat on, may be sat on. It's only the movement of muktzah which is forbidden. So what is called movement? How would one be moving it which would be included in the Isur of Tiltul. So we're going to look at 4 or 5 different types of Tiltul, which have varying degrees of severity as far as muktzah is concerned. The main Isur of muktzah, the main prohibition, is moving things with one's hand. That's what is considered the real Tiltul. And with one's hand means the way one would normally pick an object up and move it from place to place. If one takes an object between its elbows, for instance, he's using his hands, but that's not the way hands are normally used. That does not have the regular din of Tiltul Muktzah. So the prohibition is moving it the usual way with one's hands. And there are a few exceptions to this rule that one may not move muktzah with one's hands. They are, for instance, if one has to get out of the way things which are unsightly, that are on the table, which are not nice, and make the table unpleasant to sit at, that would have a din of graf shel re'i, a receptacle for waste, which we'll learn about separately in Mizat Hashem, but it doesn't have to actually be a waste receptacle in any situation where it's unpleasant to be at the table because of things that are on the table, even though those things are absolutely muktzah. What do I mean by absolutely muktzah? We'll soon learn in Mizat Hashem that there are degrees, more muktzah and less muktzah. But even in the worst case where something is absolutely muktzah and it's on the table and it's unpleasant and it makes it difficult to sit at the Shabbos table, one may move it out of the way and dump it in the wastebasket or in the garbage. So that would be an exception where one is actually allowed to move muktzah with one's hands. Say, for instance, one already has in one's hands an object which is muktzah. He didn't realize, he picked up something which he thought was whole and it turned out to be broken, and he ends up with a piece in his hand of a broken chair, drawer, doorknob, which, as we will learn in Mizat Hashem in future, shiurim become muktzah if they're not whole. They're shivrei kelim, fragments of kelim. So now he finds himself holding this muktzah object in his hand. So he doesn't have to drop it on the spot. He may put it where it belongs. If it belongs in a drawer, he may open the drawer and put it inside. He should put it in a place where it will not create problems opening the drawer later. Because, as we will learn in Mizat Hashem in future shiurim, if one put, for instance, money in a drawer and now has to open the drawer on Shabbos, in certain cases it may be forbidden to open the drawer. So when we learn those halachas, we have to bear in mind that if someone is holding muktzah, needs to put it down, he's allowed to go to wherever he needs to and put it down, but one may not make a drawer unopenable on Shabbos. One may not turn something into a bosis ledovor ha'ostur, a base for a muktzah object. So if putting the money in the drawer would mean that the drawer would be forbidden to be opened on Shabbos, then one is not allowed to put it there. So one would have to put it in a place where it wouldn't create such problems later on Shabbos. The main point that we're talking about now is that one doesn't have to drop it out of his hand when he realizes that he's holding muktzah. He's allowed to put it down in a suitable place. Likewise, if something broke, an item broke, a chair broke, and you have pieces which are laying on the floor, on the table, in a place where there's a concern that people can get hurt, one may, with one's hands, move those fragments of kelim so that no one will get hurt. But, of course, there's a difference between whether the object is moving in one's house or it's moving in, whether it's laying in one's house or it's laying in the street. One special case where one is allowed to move muktzah with one's hands, we'll learn about it in Mizta Hashem in brief because it's not so common nowadays, is the mace. A person who has Rahman al-Islam has died and his body is in a place where it may come either to disgrace or it may end up being autopsied unless a Yid removes it. One is allowed to move it with a special trick, which we'll learn about soon in Mizta Hashem, and that in order to preserve the dignity of the mace, to covet ha-mace. Likewise, in any situation where if one is in danger of being attacked by ganovim, gazlonim, because of one's valuables, one would be allowed to put away his wallet so that he doesn't come to harm and the money doesn't come to harm. One is also recalling the halachas that we learned about sick people, patients, that even a choyle she'ein bois takona, even a non-dangerously ill patient, Chachomim relaxed certain isurim d'Rabbanan for him. So in this case, one is allowed to carry muktzah for the sake of a choyle she'ein bois takona. Likewise, for the sake of koved habriyas, for the dignity of people, Chazal allowed certain things to be used for the equivalent of toilet paper if there was nothing available, nothing regular to be used as toilet paper. Chazal allowed the use of objects which would otherwise be muktzah because of koved habriyas, and we'll learn about that in Mizta Hashem when we get to the shir on that subject. So all this relates to a regular kind of carrying muktzah with one's hands. That is the worst kind of tiltul, that's the real tiltul, and that is normally forbidden with muktzah except for the examples I gave, which are exceptions. The second level is called tiltul min hatzad, literally carrying from the side, also known as tiltul kila'achar yad, carrying indirectly or in an unusual way, and that has certain rules when Chazal were matir and when Chazal were oyster. Tiltul min hatzad means that one is not carrying the object directly, but it is carried automatically by means of carrying something else. One carries the muktzah object. We are going to learn later, Mizta Hashem, that in certain situations if you have a muktzah object on top of a non-muktzah, permissible object, the permissible object becomes a basis, a base for the forbidden object, and it itself becomes muktzah. If you have a tray which is meant to put leichter on, then the tray itself becomes muktzah like the leichter. So we're not dealing with that subject now. We are not dealing with a case in which the permissible object becomes the basis for the forbidden object. And there are some complicated rules about when things do become a basis and when they do not become a basis, which we're not going to go into in this year. However, let's say you have an item lying on top of another item. The case in the Gemara is that you have barrels of wine, which of course are permissible on Shabbos and Yom Tov. They may be moved, the food, the drink, but in order to keep the lid on the barrel, in order to make sure, for example, that no cat is going to get at the lid and knock off the lid and make the wine dirty, so you put, for example, a stone on top of the lid of the barrel. So ordinarily, you would be required to tip the barrel until the stone fell off. The stone is muktzah. It's not a barrel cover, it's just a stone. It's muktzah. And you would need to tip the barrel in order to let the stone roll off. That is a lighter kind of tiltul min hatzad. You wouldn't have a problem tilting the barrel and letting the stone roll off. But let's say the barrel is positioned among other barrels, then you cannot tip the barrel. There's no room for the barrel to be maneuvered sideways. So you would be allowed to move the barrel out of its place, carry the barrel with the stone on top of it to a place where you either want a barrel or where you are more free to tip the barrel until the stone rolls off, and then you will do so. But in the meantime, you are holding the barrel with the stone on top. So you're carrying the muktzah by means of the barrel. In this case, the barrel doesn't become a basis ledover ha'osr. It doesn't become a base for the muktzah because it's not there to serve the rock. The barrel is not there to serve the stone. On the contrary, the stone is there to serve the barrel. And you certainly don't want the stone to remain there permanently. You want to get it off during the course of Shabbos. So the barrel doesn't become muktzah as a basis ledover ha'osur. It's not like the tray with the leichter. So the barrel is okay to move. The problem is that it still has the rock on top of it. A basis ledover ha'osur. Once it's forbidden to be carried on Shabbos, it's forbidden at the beginning of Shabbos, is forbidden to be carried the entire Shabbos. Even after the muktzah object has been removed, the leichter have been removed, one is still forbidden to carry the tray because it served as a basis ledover ha'osur, as a base for the muktzah when Shabbos began. But in this case of the barrel, being that it's not a basis ledover ha'osur, once the rock goes off the top of the barrel, it'll definitely be mutter to move the barrel. The barrel didn't become muktzah. The problem is, though, that while the rock is on top of the barrel, if one carries the barrel, one is carrying the rock. That is called tiltul al yedei dover achet. Tiltul min hatzad, indirect carrying, and it is permissible so long as one is interested in the dover hamutor, in the permissible object. If one is interested in transporting the rock, and you're doing it by carrying the barrel, that would be osur. If you're out to transport the rock, that's forbidden. Tiltul min hatzad is forbidden, ledovar ha'osur. But if you're out to carry a permissible item, and you have the forbidden item on top of it, you want to move the permissible item, namely the barrel, to another place to use it there, you're allowed to move the barrel even with the rock on top. That is tiltul al yedei dover acher, or tiltul min hatzad, an indirect carrying, le dover hamutar, for the sake of a permissible item, namely the barrel and the wine, and therefore it's permissible. Chadal were matir that. A tiltul min hatzad is permissible only bidi eved, if one is stuck and one is unable to manage without that carrying. In other words, it's not a blanket permission. It's not as though tiltul min hatzad is not called tiltul, and therefore it's permissible. No, it is called tiltul, and it's a problem. It's carrying muktzeh. However, it is permissible for the sake of a dovar hamuter. So if you had this object on top and it's getting in the way, you're allowed to move the permissible object for its own sake in order to get off the prohibited object. Why would it be that it's permissible for a permitted object but forbidden for a forbidden object? I mean, where's the logic? So it's explained in Achronim that if one is carrying, say, this barrel, or it doesn't have to be a barrel, it can be a basket of fruit with a stone on it. Then, if one is carrying that, the carrying, the movement is attributed to the permissible object. If I asked you, if you saw a person moving around a jug of wine with a rock on it, if I asked you, what's he moving, a rock or wine? You would answer, wine. What about the fact that the rock is there too? That's just because he can't get rid of it except by moving it. That's why he's carrying it, but he's not interested in carrying that. So the act of the movement is attributed to the wine and not to the rock. However, if indeed he's able to get rid of the rock, and he's carrying it on top of the barrel because he wants the rock elsewhere, then it's noticeable that he actually is transporting the rock. He could have gotten rid of the rock. He didn't, because he wants the rock in the other place. He's carrying it for the rock. Now the carrying is attributed to the dover also, that's forbidden. Now, a practical case, if one has something on the table which one doesn't want there, it's not Shabbosdik, and one wants it off, then one would be allowed to tip the table and let the object fall off. Because in this case, what is one interested in? The table. Why are you getting the object off the table? Because you want to use the space on the table. So that's the dover hamuter. The table, the permissible object, and you're moving the forbidden thing off the table for the permissible object. If the object will break if you tip the table, and it might fall down and break other things if you just tip it off and let it fall, and for that reason you want to carry it with the forbidden object on it so that it won't break anything, then you would be allowed to move the table again so that you'll be able to use the table, the space on the table, which is the dover hamuter, after you've gotten rid of the object that's in the way and you've moved it to a place where you're able to tip it off without doing any damage. We learned before that tipping an object off, making it roll off, is a lighter form of tiltul min hatzad. However, even tipping things off is only permissible if it is for the sake of the permissible object. If one wants to move the forbidden object, in order to have the forbidden object elsewhere, you wouldn't even be allowed to tip it off the permissible object. So, for instance, if you have money on a pillow and you forgot the money there, you didn't put the money there. If you put the money there, you intended it to be there all Shabbos, then the pillow would become forbidden. It is a bostis ledovor ho'osr, but you didn't put the money there. You forgot it. You put it there erev Shabbos. You were getting changed for Shabbos, and you forgot the money there before Shabbos. And you don't need that pillow on the Shabbos. You don't need the space that the money occupies on the pillow, so you're not going to put your head on it. But you don't want to leave the money open there on the pillow. It might get stolen, children might play and tear the bill. You're not allowed to shake off the money from the pillow because that is tiltul min hatzad, tipping it off. What are you interested in this case? The money. The money is the mukta object. So you're tipping the permissible object in order to get rid of the forbidden object, carrying the forbidden object by means of the permissible one. The money by means of the pillow, tiltul min hatzad, but it's for the sake of the forbidden object, the money. So even if you're not actually carrying the pillow from place to place, you're merely tipping it in order to get the money off, that would also be forbidden. If one really didn't want the money on the pillow because it was a bad idea to leave it there exposed, and you would incur a considerable loss leaving it there, then there's an eight. We'll learn the eight in Mitzvah Hashem in a few minutes. There is a way, but to move the money by tipping or shaking the pillow would be forbidden. That is tiltul min hatzad l'toirach dover ha'osr. A further case in which Chazal permitted a person to do tiltul min hatzad is in a case where a child is carrying a forbidden object. If one picks up the child while he's holding that forbidden object, he's holding a rock. So one is picking up the forbidden object by means of the permissible object. One is not allowed to do that if the intention was to move the forbidden object. In the case of a rock, I don't suppose anybody's looking to do anything special with a rock, but suppose the child was holding money, and you wanted the money to drop out of his hand. You didn't want him to carry the money with him. So to pick up the child in order to get the money to another place would be carrying the muktzah by means of the child for the sake of the money. That tiltul min hatzad l'toirach dover ha'osr. And again, that would be forbidden. The only case in which it would be permissible is if the child was very attached to the money that he was holding, and he really needed to be carried by his parent because he was lonesome, he wanted to be with them, and he felt abandoned if they wouldn't pick him up. Then for the sake of the child, in that case, one would be allowed to pick up the child even as the child was holding the money in his hand. However, it is not permissible to take the child's hand and shake the money out of it, because that too is tiltul min hatzad l'toirach dover ha'osr. So again, the permissible case is where the child is attached to his money and attached to the parent, can't leave go, doesn't want to leave go of either one. Then one would be allowed to pick up the child and carry the child with the money in his hand. Now we're talking obviously inside a house or inside a yard that's surrounded with a fence, which is a reshus hayochid. We're not dealing with the laws of carrying in the street on Shabbos, only with the laws of carrying muktzah. In fact, one additional clause of this din is that if the child was holding something very valuable, then one would not even be allowed to walk with the child holding his hand in case the money that he's holding in his other hand falls out of his hand in the street, and then one would be tempted to pick up the money and carry it. One might forget that it's Shabbos, and because he has the money here in the street, he would forget that it's Shabbos and be tempted to carry the money. So you're not even allowed to hold the child by the hand in that case, even if the child is crying. So you have to find some other way to make him let go of the muktzah. But what Chazal would go is that a person will end up carrying in the street, and therefore it's also to even walk the child. The third, back to this second. A part of this tiltul min hatzad is an interesting argument between the Taz, the Turei Zohov, the Mefarish on the Shulchan Aruch by Reb David Halevi, the Rav of Krakow, the son-in-law of the Bach, the Bayis Chodesh Reb Yoel's circus in Poland in the 1600s, famous commentary on all of Shulchan Aruch. We call it Taz for short, Turei Zohov, rows of gold. And the Taz maintains that suppose one had on the table shells, say eggshells. Eggshells are useless, inedible for anybody, not even an animal would eat it. So the muktzah, they don't particularly disturb your enjoyment of the Shabbos meal. So it's not like a weight matter, which we discussed earlier, that you're allowed to move with your hands. You're allowed to take off waste matter which is unpleasant, unsightly, and therefore disturbing your sitting at the table. That's a graf shari'i. But when it's time, you have eggshells and you want to remove it from the table. So the Taz writes in Simin Shin Ches, Sivkot Yud Ches, that you could take a knife and scrape off by means of the knife a section of the tablecloth where the eggshells are laying in order to clear the tablecloth or the table. Why? The logic, said the Taz, is like this. I want to clear the table. The table is permissible. The space on the table which I'm clearing by removing the eggshells is permissible. How am I removing the eggshells? Not directly with my hands, but by means of the knife. That tiltul min hatzad letzoyrech dovor hamuter, I'm carrying indirectly for the sake of something permissible, namely the table. That is the opinion of the Taz. However, the Alter Rebbe argues, the Alter Rebbe maintains in Seif Stamach, in Siman Shin Ches, Seif Stamach, the Alter Rebbe argues and says that in this case he is not being metaltel min hatzad. The knife becomes an extension of one's hand. He's simply using it as a tool. So if you remember, we learned in Hilchas Breira as well that if one is using a knife or a fork in order to take the desired food out of the undesired food, and remember the rule is that one is only permitted to take the desired food from the undesired with one's hand, not with a tool, a separation tool. So a knife, a fork, a spoon are all considered an extension of one's hand. Here too, the Alter Rebbe doesn't make the comparison, but the Alter Rebbe simply said that over here too, it's a yad arucha, it's like a long hand. A person's hand became extended into the knife, and he's using the knife as an extension of his hand to remove the eggshell from the table. When do we say that tiltul hayedei dover acher is permissible as toirach dover hamuter? If one already had something on the dover hamuter, as in the examples we discussed before, one already had a basket of fruit with a stone inside. And now one is carrying the stone by carrying the basket of fruit, or the stone by means of the barrel of wine, then it tilts like the dover acher. But to use a tool to scrape it off would be forbidden. The same is true if one had things on the floor which were disturbing people's walking space, and you wanted to clear the floor with a broom. The objects were muktzah, and you wanted to clear them with a broom to make space to walk. Then, according to the Alter Rebbe, that too would be also. We're not talking about where the objects on the floor can be dangerous to people if they walk on them. That we learned about before. One would even be allowed to pick it up with one's hand if necessary. But if it's just in the way, so the Alter Rebbe would consider the broom an extension of one's hand, and it would be also to move it, even though it's tiltul min tzad, it would seem to be tiltul min tzad, and even though the purpose is to clear the floor, which is adover hamuter, nevertheless, it would be forbidden according to the Alter Rebbe, because is that not called tiltul min tzad? It's called tiltul biyadayim, with one's hands, except that one's hand became extended by means of the broom. The third area, type of carrying, which we won't be able to conclude today, I'll just mention the categories, is tiltul al yedei gufa, using one's body in order to move muktzah. Now I mentioned before that if one had money on a pillow and one didn't need the pillow, one just wanted to remove the money from the pillow in order to make sure that nothing happened to it, then one would not be allowed to even shake the money off the pillow to make sure that it's not visible. One wouldn't be allowed to do it with one's hand. Tiltul min hatzad lezoirech dover ha'osur. However, one would be allowed to remove it with one's body, as I said before. Moving with one. There is an eitzah that the eitzah is moving with one's body is not in the same category of tiltul, even as tiltul min hatzad is the third category, generally permissible, but we'll learn more in Mitzvah Hashem in our next shir exactly when it is and when it's not permissible. The fourth one is by means of one's feet. And there too, there are certain distinctions. Generally speaking, it is said that one is allowed to move muktzah with one's feet, but exactly how and when needs to be discussed in more detail. So Mitzvah Hashem in our coming shir. A brief idea in Pnimis Torah, in the inner Torah, in serving Hashem, that we are able to glean from the halachas of muktzah can be seen from the words of the Alter Rebbe in Tanya in Perek Mem Vov. The Alter Rebbe explained there, based on a pasuk in Tehillim, Vani bar veloi eido. I, says Ostov, one of the composers of the Kapitlach of Tehillim, Ostov said on behalf of all Knesset Yisrael in Golus, because that's the nature of that Perek in Tehillim, is talking about Yidden in Golus, as we see in the other psukim in that Perek Ayin Gimel. So Ostov says there, Vani bar veloi edo. I was like a brute, without knowledge. Behemois hoyizti imoch. I was with you, Hashem, like a behemah, like a beast. Vani tomid imoch. And yet I was always with you. I'm always with you. Despite the fact that I'm a bar, like a brute, and I, without knowledge, like a behemoth, nevertheless, I'm always with you. The Alter Rebbe brings out there that the meaning of these words is that even though a person, especially in Golus, doesn't know meaning, he doesn't feel, he's not sensitive as the Alter Rebbe stresses again and again in Tanya, that das means to feel, to sense. So, Veloy Edo, I don't sense. I'm oblivious to the Kedusha which rests upon me through a mitzvah. Really, whenever I does a mitzvah, like we say in the bracha before, mitzvah shekidishonu b'mitzvah yisovitzivonu, Hashem commanded us. He's sanctified us with the commandment, which means, that the Alter Rebbe explained earlier in the Perek, kidishonu, Hashem made us close to Him, just like a husband and wife are brought together with the greatest unity through Kiddushin. That's the kind of unity that a Yid experiences with Hashem every time he does a mitzvah. But I said also on behalf of Yidden in Golus, I was like a brute, and I don't know, and I don't sense that Kiddusha. Vani tomid imoch. Nevertheless, I am always with you. Because the Alter Rebbe said, gewaltige words, She'ein ha'choymer meinea ba'ad yichud ha'nefesh. Yichud ha'nefesh ba'oirin soif baruch hu. The choymer, the coarseness of a person, doesn't block the unity of his soul. It doesn't stop his soul from being united with Hashem, the Ein Sof Baruch Hu. That unity is still there. We may not feel the effect of the mitzvah. We may be oblivious. Nothing's happening, it seems. Just an action. Meanwhile, what's really happening is, whatever our level, no matter how low, no matter how insensitive, that doesn't stop our neshamas from being connected to Hashem with the greatest unity. And the Alter Rebbe continues, now we understand why it is that an Amhoret, a total ignoramus, a boor, an illiterate, boorish person who knows nothing about Yiddishkeit, he doesn't understand. Nevertheless, if he transgresses the laws of Shabbos or the laws of Pesach, then he's chayiv, he's liable to the same penalty as a tzaddik is liable. How can you compare? As the Rebbe brings in the Hagor, in a note on that chapter in Tanya, it doesn't seem logical. How can you compare the Kedusha which rests upon the tzaddik and the Kedusha which rests upon the soul of the Amoritz and say that they're the same? The penalty which the person gets is because he's mechalel, he desecrates the Kedusha of Shabbos and Yom Tov which rests upon his soul. But how can you compare the Kedusha of the one and the other? So the Alter Rebbe, now we understand. Despite the fact that he's an Amoritz and a Boor, that doesn't stop his neshama from connecting with Hashem. And the Rebbe gives us an example. The Alter Rebbe gives us an example. Even carrying muktzah and even eating a mashahu, an iota, a crumb of chometz, which are both D'Rabbanan according to the Alter Rebbe. We learned earlier in the Shir, muktzah is D'Rabbanan. Nevertheless, they blemish the soul of an Amoret who moves a stone on Shabbos from place to place. They blemish his soul in the same way as the soul of a tzaddik. The soul of an Amoret is like the soul of a tzaddik. So the Alter Rebbe specifically teaches us about muktzah, which is an Isur Gavre. There's nothing wrong with the muktzah itself. It's the act of moving the muktzah. Nevertheless, the two different kinds of gavra, the two different kinds of people, the Amorit and the Tzaddik, are the same insofar as the effect on their neshamas.